Well, this is the second thing that we're dealing with on Hilchot Shabbat as to date. Volume 18 has been published and volume 19 is in the final stages of preparation. So it should be published hopefully next week already. There are planned to be 7 volumes on Hilchot Shabbat, I think. There'll probably be more in the end, but that's the plan. And I just mentioned, as I've mentioned before, sponsorship opportunities are available. If anybody is able and interested in sponsoring, please come and speak to me. Okay, but we are working our way through Kavod Shabbat, Onik Shabbat, right? As we've discussed many times, we have 2 separate aspects of Shabbat. There's Zachor and Shamor. Zachor dealing with the positive aspect, what we are meant to do in Shabbat. Shamor, of course, that is the framework, what we have to refrain from, the malachot which we cannot do on Shabbat. There's far more halachic literature written about Shamor, just by virtue of the fact there are 39 malachot, many great details. We haven't started any of those yet. We will get there. But first we're working our way through the Zachors, because it's impossible to cover everything, but we'll do our best. So we've been talking about Hadlakat Nerot, Tosefet Shabbat, when Shabbat begins, Knizat Shabbat, Seudot Shabbat, right, meals, Lechem Mishnah, etc. Last week we finished off talking about Shalosh Seudot, Seudah Shlishit, etc. Just one Hashlama, which we didn't talk about. We had actually mentioned 2 weeks ago, and we didn't finish. So if you go to page 121 in the books, we started talking about Lechem Mishnah, right? We discussed the idea of why we have Lechem Mishnah, which loaf we should cut, talking about the bottom loaf before the top one on Friday night, etc. We spoke about all of that. Now, a question that comes up, sometimes you come to a meal. Last week, we also spoke about whether Seudah Shlishit, one is required, ideally, one is required to have bread and to have Lechem Mishnah as well. So sometimes you come to a Shabbos meal, maybe it's more common to, Seudah Shlishit, by the time you come down, you've washed, there aren't any rolls left, okay, there's not much you can do. Hopefully you have a box of matzahs or something like that as backup. But sometimes you're at home and you have your Lechem Mishnah. Friday night, usually you have the 2 loaves, no problem, but maybe you forgot, or maybe it's Shabbat morning, and you only have 1 loaf left, but there's another one in the freezer. Okay, are you allowed to take a roll or a challah which is frozen, i.e. it's not currently fit to be eaten, and can we use that as Lechem Mishnah? Meaning, does the Lechem Mishnah mean I have 2 loaves, even though I'm only going to eat from one of them, but theoretically, I could eat from both of them? Or does it have to be, is this merely symbolic? So, in the bottom of page 121, you'll see Shut Oratzion, Rav Ben Zion Abba Shaul, and he says, Mutar tzaref lechem kafur, the Lechem Mishnah. Okay, that is the most lenient opinion. He says, yes, he says at the end of the day, it's bread. Now, again, all of this is based on the fact, first of all, it's to say that theoretically, at some point, if you take the loaf out of the freezer, it could, at some point, will be edible on Shabbat. If it's not going to be edible the entire Shabbat, so then we have a problem of Motza'ei, right? But even though you can't eat it now, he says the frozen bread could be used for Lechem Mishnah. Now, if Shlomo Zalman Auerbach disagrees, he says maybe it's not so simple. If you turn over the page, he says this is brought here from the Shemrat Shabbat Hilchot. As we know, Shemrat Shabbat Hilchot many times the Talmud of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he brings a lot of what his opinions in the footnotes. He says, "Shamati Magon Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Yitachen, the Basha'ah Shalechem Kashe Ke'even." Right, it's really frozen. It's hard as rock. V'lo ra'oi la'achila. It's not fit. It's not edible. Eino yachol litzaref Lechem Mishnah. It says Lechem Mishnah is the bread that you could eat, but you can't eat it, so therefore it doesn't count. Im b'da'ato la'alif b'sudato ad she'aloi lema'achal. If you're going to have a very long Shabbos meal, I'm sure you've all been at Shabbos meals like this. right? And it's going to be very, very long. So by the time you're still eating, it will have it will have softened and it will be ready to eat. He compares it very interestingly too. For example, I have boiling hot soup, which I can't eat now. I can wait until it cools down, and then I can eat it. So he says maybe the meal's long, and then you can include that as well. So that's a little bit more. It's a bit more lenient in that sense. I bring here at the bottom of page 121, also in the footnote, Vosman Shevet HaLevi. He's the third approach. He's much more stringent. He says no, you can never use frozen challah for lechem mishneh. He says at the time that you make the bracha, it has to be edible. It has to be. So those are three different opinions in terms of that. Obviously, it's not ideal to just have the frozen bread, but if one has nothing else, or in Shabbat Chag, certainly we've seen there is what to rely on. Another interesting point, just about lechem mishneh, source number 42. So now on page 123, the Piskei Teshuvot brings. He says, "B'achronim matzinu ladun b'mahut geder hashalem le'inyan lechem mishneh." What is called, when you say lechem mishneh, you need to have two whole loaves. What is considered a whole loaf? You know, sometimes there's a bit of a challah that's broken off, or with the matzahs, it gets a bit more complicated. You get the shmura matzah for Seder, you get the box of the handmade matzahs, and you open up. You hope that you'll find the three matzahs which are whole. Interesting, by the way, in terms of that, there is a minhag reported in the Hilchot Yaakov, and in the days, seemingly they had this minhag, I'm not sure if it was in the days of Rishonim, maybe the Achronim, but they actually had four matzahs at Leil HaSeder. You may have heard of this. So we have three, and there was a fourth matzah called the matzah safek, because in case one of the matzahs broke or was old, they would have an extra one. That was the four. In those days, and to have four matzahs was something. Nowadays, in whole box, have as many as you want. Times of luxury. Okay, but in any event, so what is considered whole? He says, now in both. So you should have two chalot which are whole and separate from one another. There's a little bit that's removed, but it's not recognizable. You know, you look at it, it still looks whole. It's the kind of thing that people would look at, and people would say, okay, it looks whole, even though it's, you don't have to look at your challah with a microscope, right, to examine that it's called shalem. Therefore, when somebody, what happens sometimes, you bake chalot and a number of chalot together in the same tray. Sometimes they're touching each other and they get stuck together. And you remove them apart, it looks like somebody took a bite out of one. So then, if it's in such a way, you have your two colors or your two rolls, right? You can see that they were stuck together, and there's nothing missing. That's just the way they were separated. That's fine. And this is a principle that we have throughout halakha, not just in Hilchot Shabbat, but throughout what's called the Lo Nitna Torah leMalachei HaShareh. It always relates to things the way that we see them with our five senses. Actually, it's going to be very relevant to the topic we're talking about today. But for example, things which are only recognizable in a laboratory, things you can only see under the microscope, generally speaking, are exceptions. But generally speaking, Torah does not give credence to such things. So tefillin, for example, tefillin have to be square, be completely square. Is a person required to take a ruler and to measure exactly? No, look, it looks square. To that's considered. Okay. Yes.
Because 9 different sets.
Yeah.
And they're all connected.
Yeah.
But if you look on the top, it looks like it's pretty big.
So that's exactly what he says here. So the question was asked, right, into a pull apart challah, but that's exactly what he says here. He says if you have two different challah, and you can see that the shape of it is such that they were going together, but it still looks whole. That's fine. That's still considered shalem.
Except that's not so far apart. Right? Those are two different cases. You have two separate distinctions.
Yes.
Pull away in that sense, it's like it's one piece. You can tear it apart that way after, but you want it to be considered.
Okay, so if it's all right, so if it's all stuck together and it's all considered, it's all one.
Right.
So that is one. That is one loaf. Now there are al minhag, as we know, is to have two. We saw the number two, the numbers repeat themselves. So when it comes to Shabbos candles, the 2 candles, now we increase. We haven't heard that we increased a lot. Maybe we should, right, for the number of people in the household. But there is a minhag that's brought in the Arizal that he would have 12 chalot. You can see here in source number 44, the Hilchot Yosef says yesh nagin al pi Arizal ve'aniach al shulchan yudbet kitarot ktanim lekol seudah. Your reliefs here, they are small. When you have 12 loaves, shisha al gabei shisha, 6 on top of 6. Okay, seemingly this is something to do with the Kabbalah. And he says here, even if you don't study Kabbalah, you're allowed to follow this practice if you want. Says the Hilchot Yosef, but again, the more common practice, I think, is to have the two loaves. Okay, let's. That was just a hashlama in terms of Lechem Mishnah and Sudot Shabbat. Let's skip now to page 155. And let us now talk about the end of Shabbat. We spoke about the beginning of Shabbat. We spoke about Tosefet Shabbat at the beginning. Let's talk about the end, and we'll get on to the question of Haftalah. What is Haftalah? What do we do before Haftalah, after Haftalah, etc. But before that, we need to know when, and it's very, very complicated, as Manei Hayom tend to be. We try and get an overview of the basic concepts. Obviously, we won't be able to go into all the details in the short time. So, page 155, where this discussion begins is as follows. We have a concept in Halakha, as we all know, called Bein Hashmashot. Bein Hashmashot is the time between day and night, right? How to define that time and how long is it, and where is it? It's further going to be complicated by the fact that Bein Hashmashot, how long it will be, will change based on where you are in the world, based on when you are throughout the year. Every day it's going to be different, depending on the angle of the sun, depending on a number of different factors, depending on your altitude as well. So it's not clear. But what we know is this. We have day and we have night. And in between day and night, we have a period called Bein Hashmashot. And the question is Bein Hashmashot considered, or is it considered night? And the answer is that it's considered neither, right? It's a safek, we don't know. And therefore, we have to treat it as if it's both. So we have to treat it in the sense that it's day. So when it comes to Friday and Erev Shabbat, okay, because if Bein Hashmashot is considered night, generally speaking, we'll see in a moment. But let's assume for the moment that Bein Hashmashot begins at Shkia, begins at sunset. Okay, so the period between sunset and nightfall, to make things easy, because it's not actually that simple, but the period between sunset and nightfall is referred to as Bein Hashmashot, and that is a Safek Yom, Safek Layla. So if that period is night, and if night begins at sunset, so then when we accept Shabbat, we would have to before sunset. Okay, that's what we discussed in the past. That's going according to the opinion that Bein Hashmashot may be night. If Bein Hashmashot was day, so we could actually bring in Shabbat a little bit later. Okay, but we don't do that. So we say that. So we hold that it's night, and therefore we have to begin Shabbat before sunset. Now, if it's night begins at sunset, that means that in theory Shabbat could go out then, right? But no, but what if it's day? So then that period of Bein Hashmashot of sunset, that is day, then it's still Shabbat. We have to wait until nightfall, and therefore we go l'chumra in both directions. So on Friday, we relate to Bein Hashmashot as being night, and therefore we begin Shabbat earlier. On Shabbat, we relate to it as being day, and therefore we have to wait until after that period before we bring out Shabbat. So let's see the Gemara, source number 1 on page 155. This is in the Gemara Shabbat. It says like Tanu Rabbanan Bein Hashmashot Safek min hayom umin halayla. Right, this period of Bein Hashmashot, or in English Bein Hashmashos, right, is Safek day and Safek maybe day or maybe night. Safek kulo min hayom, Safek kulo min halayla. I mean, the entire period is a Safek. It's completely day or completely night, and therefore matilin oto l'chomesh shnei yamim. And therefore we apply to it the stringencies of both day and night. Now, the question that you're all thinking is, when is Bein Hashmashot? How long is Bein Hashmashot? When does it begin and when does it end? If only it were that simple. If only. So we have a number of opinions, first of all, in the Tanaim, and then we'll have different opinions in the Rishonim, how to understand the Tanaim, and then different opinions in the Achronim, how to understand the Rishonim. And you have all sorts of calendars today, and nobody can make head or tail of what anything says, right? This is where it all begins. So, Ezeu Bein Hashmashot. Mi shetishka hachama, kol zman shepnei hamizrach ma'dimin, hichsif atachton v'lo tzif ha'elyon Bein Hashmashot. Okay, continue, I'll just read a little more. Hichsif ha'elyon b'shval atachton zeu layla, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, so the first opinion we have is Rabbi Yehuda. Essentially, Rabbi Yehuda tells us that Bein Hashmashot begins Mishetishkach Hama, when the sun sets. Okay, good. That's all we all know. That's all we're all familiar with. But he says when the horizon starts to become red, right? The sun sets. You can no longer see it. That is the time of Bein Hashmashot. That's when it begins. We'll see a little bit later on. The Gemara will give. Actually, let's skip a little bit because the Gemara will give us a little bit more detail on this. If you have a look at the last paragraph in source number 1 on the page. So it says, Amar Rabba, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Karoch b'tanya. Ezu ben hashmashot, mishtishkach hama kol zman she'pnei mizrach ma'adinin. Right? That's essentially, that's what we just said, that this is all Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. And now he says, okay, so over the page, the second paragraph over the page. Again, it's a long sugya and it's complicated. We're just taking out bits and pieces. But it says the itma. Shiur ben hashmashot bekam. So how long is this period of ben hashmashot? Amar Rabba, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Shlosha chelkei mil. Mai shlosha chelkei mil, elat lata riv'im. Okay, so essentially the conclusion here is that it's 3/4 of a mil. A mil is a measurement of distance. Okay, part of this is going to be further complicated now because nobody can agree. When we say a mil, we mean the time it takes the average person to walk a mil. How long does it take an average person to walk a mil? So, yeah, all the shiurim that we have in Chazal, and all the shiurim that they Gemara are not, absolute shiurim like absolute measurements like we have today. The truth is that the absolute measurements we have today themselves are arbitrary, right? You think about like a minute to 60 seconds or whatever it is, or a kilogram, or certain measurements of weight, measurements of distance. Why do we have those measurements? Who decided? There's some metal bar somewhere in where's it, in France, in Paris, in the Institute of Standards, where they have to so everybody knows, how long it is or how much it weighs. Okay. All of that is arbitrary. So Chazal gave us measurements. All the measurements that we have are based on things that we see, based on things that we do. An amma is the length of one's arm, a tefach is the length of a fist, etc. Problem is, as I say, a gazayit, the size of an olive, right? So for hundreds of years, we're going to have arguments in terms of how big olives are. And then when we can prove how big olives are, we'll say, no, the olives used to be a different size, so that's irrelevant, right? So this is how it goes. So in terms of this, we're saying the time it takes the average person to walk a mil. This is a measurement which comes up in many different areas in halakha. It comes up over here, of course. It comes up for zmanim. It comes up for baking matzahs. Right, how long do now? So matzahs, I'll tell you how long are we allowed for the matzahs? 18 minutes. Okay. So the shitot that we have essentially go from 18 to 24 minutes. Those are the most common opinions. That the length of a mil is somewhere between 18 and 24 minutes. Again, in the days of Chazal, the concept of minutes wasn't really something which was relevant. I've mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again every time. It's worth saying. I once davened in a shul. So all these ideas was Manei Hayom. Here we're talking about Shabbat, but also in terms of when day begins and when you can daven, the earliest time say Kriyat Shema, the ideal time say Kriyat Shema. Chazal talk about Anetzach Hama, the time when the sun starts to rise, we can start to see. So I once davened in a shul where they had a batik in minyan, and they had a piece of paper for the chazan, okay, on the stender, which had the times for Kriyat Shema, for the Amidah, etc., to the second. So it's like 6, 25, and 13 seconds when you have to get. I don't think that's what Chazal had in mind when they gave us these shiurim and gave us these measurements. It's a certain estimate, but in any event. So the length of a mil is somewhere between 18 and 24 minutes, right? By Pesach, we go by 18 minutes, but we go to Chumrah, okay? But there are times when we take it differently. So here the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the time of the length of Bein Hashmashot, right? He told us, he gives us a visual sign, sort of an astronomical sign to see, which is when the horizon starts to get red, when the sun sets, that's when it begins. And it continues for 3/4 of a mil. So how long is 3/4 of a mil? It depends how long a mil is. So it will be, depending based when we go from 18 to 24 minutes, somewhere between 13 and a half to 18 minutes. Okay, and this is where these numbers come from, based on this. Now, the Gemara actually says over here, Amar Rabba Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Alachak Rabbi Yehuda, Linyan Shabbat. That by Shabbat we pass like Rabbi Yehuda, i.e., in terms of the length of Bein Hashmashot, we hold like Rabbi Yehuda. What we're going to see, the challenge is going to be, and it's going to come up soon, is okay, we have here a measurement in terms of time, in terms of the theory, what it's meant to be. But what happens when that contradicts with that which I see? You're telling me Benesh Mashot is the time of twilight, it's the time when the sun has gone down, but it's not quite nightfall. So what if I see that it's been past, okay, 18 minutes, but right since the sun has gone down, but it's still light outside, or it's not quite dark, or I haven't seen stars. Okay, that's going to be a question. That's going to be, as you can imagine, a machloket amongst the Achronim. But that is one opinion. That's Rabbi Yehuda. He says in terms of the length of Benesh Mashot. Let's go back to page 155. Let's see the other opinions. Yeah. So about halfway through source number 1. So we saw Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Now we have Rabbi Nachem. Rabbi Nachem Yomer Kadei She'alech Adam Mi Shetishka Chama Chatzim. Okay. So Rabbi Nachem says Benesh Mashot is how long? Half a minute. Okay. So that is going to, as both Rabbi Yehuda said, 3/4. So Rabbi Nachem says it's even shorter. Rabbi Yossi Omer Benesh Mashot Heref Ayin. Rabbi Yossi says no. Benesh Mashot, this time that we're talking about, that it's Safek Yom Safek Laila, it's an instant, and it's over. It's impossible to calculate when it is. It's too short. Okay. What the Gemara later says, it comes out from the Sugya. You don't have it in the sources in front of you, but it comes out that Rabbi Yossi's Benesh Mashot takes place later. Right? It's not just the difference in terms of how long it is, but it's a difference in terms of when it is. And what comes out of this is that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda in terms of the length of Benesh Mashot. We also accept Rabbi Yossi's opinion, and therefore we would have to be careful that Benesh Mashot would actually continue a little bit later. So the problem is this. Okay, so far everything's good. And as complicated as that was, everything is still fine. What comes out of it is that we said Benesh Mashot, according to Rabbi Yehuda, 3/4 of a minute. Okay, somewhere between 13 and a half to 18 minutes. Okay. Now we get to okay. So we'll come back to source number 2 in a moment. Let's look at source number 3 first, because this is where things are going to get very, very complicated. Source number 3 is the Gemara Pesachim. The Gemara Pesachim says like this: Kama malech adam beinoni bayom 10 parsaot me'alot hashachar v'netzach hama abat milim. Okay, this is again based on the Gemara and based on these sugyot, is how the different Rishonim work out their calculations for how long the meal is, etc. Then it says mishkiyat hachama v'tzeit kochavim abat milim. Right, from Shkiyat HaChama until Tzeit HaKochavim, which is essentially, as we understand thus far, that is the time of Benesh Mashot. Benesh Mashot is from sunset until nightfall. And says the Gemara, it is how long? How long does that take? Person can walk 4 minutes. Didn't Rabbi Yehuda just say you can walk 3/4 of a minute? Okay, so this is considerably longer period of time. So yeah, so we have a stira which we have to resolve. And everybody agrees that there's stira that we have to resolve. One Gemara tells me that Benesh Mashot is 3/4 of a minute. One Gemara tells me that Benesh Mashot is 4 minutes.
Is that actually going up? What the Shachar Penetz is the same time as it's the typical line?
What's that?
Because he says both of them are Avat Milim, right? From Avot Shachar Penetz is the same thing Shketa Chamato to Tzita Chochamim, right? He's calling, right? Is it more or less the same amount of time than that? I mean,
yeah, I mean,
like, is he trying to say on any given day they want, the two align, or is it just
that's what it sounds like,
right?
But it's right. So the truth is there are a lot of difficulties there as well. Now, one of the ways that we might resolve it is that you'll notice the previous Gemara spoke about Bein Hashmashot. Yeah, it doesn't say Bein Hashmashot. It says Mishkat HaChamad Tzeit HaKochavim. So it might be that Bein Hashmashot is not completely aligned with from Shkat HaChamad to Tzeit HaKochavim. Maybe there's something else. Maybe there's different concepts that are involved as well. And here we get to what is known as everybody's heard of Zman Rabbeinu Tam. Right? So Zman Rabbeinu Tam, this is based on this machloket, the stira that we have between these two Gemarot. The truth is that going back in the days of the Rishonim, I mean, nowadays, you think there's the normal Zmanim, the time that we hold, the other opinion is what's known as Shitat HaGeonim, the other one's made popular. But, Rabbeinu Tam is this outlier. There's one opinion. The truth is, a careful reading of the sources, most of the Rishonim actually seem to agree with Rabbeinu Tam. Shulchan Aruch seem to follow Rabbeinu Tam as well. But we'll see later on, that's not how it develops. And Rabbeinu Tam is a very, very interesting Shita over here. It's not always fully understood. And part of it is, again, when you read the way he explains and the understanding of the astronomy, I suppose, does not align fully with modern science, but nonetheless, the principles still work in terms of the calculation. And this is what he says. Source number 4 is Sefer Yashar, which is Rabbi Natan, and he says as follows. He says, "Lo teima misha'a sherotzeh chama likanes barakia deme'az u'matchil le'aden, ela mishetishka chama shekvar nichnesa barakia ve'avra be'ovyo shel rakia v'hu adayin keneged hachalom." In other words, says Rabbi Natan, the first thing you have to understand is that when we say mishetishka chama, when the sun sets, okay, there are two different things, two different concepts that are being alluded to over here. Sunset does not mean necessarily sunset, i.e. the time that you think that it's no longer visible to us. It's that Shkia, he says, as he said, again, this is based on the understanding of the time that the sun enters a certain place in the firmament, as we know nowadays, right? It's not actually the sun that's moving, it's actually the earth that's rotating, etc. But nonetheless, the point is, it's referring to a different time. It's referring to a different time. It says, "Mishum shadayin lo ba'ad chalono v'lo pasak chalono alech b'achar ha'kippah u'metil zur'onu ma'adim l'shabbat." Okay, so let's see the second paragraph. Now he starts to explain how this affects the halacha. He says, "Al kochach ani tzarich lefaresh shemi shetishkach chama kamo sheperashti shekvar nichnesa b'rakia." In other words, says Rabbi Natan, when it says mishtishka chama, when we're talking now about ben eshnashot, and we're talking about shkia, we're not actually talking about shkia as the time, what we refer to as sunset, when you can't see the sun. He says, "T'itayim misha shetchil lechanes, ze no yachol liot," says that can't be. Da'amin v'peret misha, yatamei b'psachim, v'gmam psachim, which we saw, the ovyo shel rakia chad mishisha shel yom, misha shkiat chama v'tzet ha'kochavim, chameshet milen. So we have 5 now. ואחר בין השמשות צדק ערבים ולילה, כדאמין להם ביום בין השמשות 3 לילה. So, in other words, what is like this? Without getting into, because it starts to get very, very technical, without getting into all the details, just have a look, page 158, in the second paragraph where he says, yeah, amazing, Ela kocha, mishkiat hachama yom gamur. In other words, it says Rabbi Natan like this. There are 2 stages of what we call Shkiat HaChama. So the first Shkiat HaChama, what sunset, meaning after sunset that is visible to us, it is still day. Okay. It's still daytime. משומחי גרסין בין משקעת החמה משעה שיתחיל לכנס פרקיה לשקוע. משתשקע משמע שנכנס כבר ועדיין לא הגיע לאחורי טיפה מפה ואקום. In other words, like this. Let me show you. I have this, you can see it. Yes. As follows. We have essentially the way Rabbi Natan understands, the way everybody understands is as follows. The 2 Gemarot, one talks about 3/4 of a mil, and one talks about 4 mil. He understands that one talking about that 3/4 of a mil, that Ben Esmashot, that is a period that's part of the 4 mil. The 4 mil is the entire Ben Esmashot, which is Mishtishkach Chama until Tzeta Kochavim, from the beginning of sunset until nightfall. But how Rabbeinu understands is as follows: the 3/4 mil, what we call Ben Hashmashot, or you call Ben Hashmashot, that's at the very end of that period. Meaning that Ben Hashmashot, that ends at night, but that begins, the Shkia, which it begins, is not the Shkia that we see from the sunset, it's much later than that. 3¼ mil after that has begun. Here you can see, if you can see this diagram, I'm not sure if you can see it, this is from our Rimon Sefer, but essentially what he says is like this: we have the entire period from the beginning of Shkia until Tzeta Kochavim, right, is 4 mil. So it's only at the end when he calls here Sofa Shkia, or what he calls, this is sunset, when the sun is entering the firmament, whatever it means. It's typical, we don't really understand it. Again, scientifically, it's probably not accurate. But that doesn't matter. So that last period, that is the 3/4 mil that we were talking about. But it begins all the way back. What we see as Shkia, that's the beginning of the 4 mil. Okay, so essentially what this means is as follows: is that the time of nightfall, a certain nightfall, according to Rabbeinu Tam,
3¼ later.
It's going to be 3.25 later, right? Because the whole thing is 4. So from the time of Shkia, what we see as sunset, you now have to count 4 mil. And again, how long is that going to be? So that is going to be depending on how long we count the 18 to 24 minutes. But if it's 18, so 18 times 24, right? And that is when it's going. That's when it's going to be 9 mil. What comes out of this as well is something which sounds a little bit absurd, is that for those first 3.25 mil, I mean after Shkia, that's still day. Going to Rabbeinu Tam, that's still day, right? Now, why does he say this? He says this because that's the only way he can resolve the sugyas, the machloket between them. And as I say, most of the Rishonim seem to follow his opinion. The Rif and the Rambam don't write explicitly. They don't write explicitly how to define it. So there are those who want to say that they agree, those they don't agree. But it's possible that they follow him. And the Shulchan Aruch as well. Look at source number 5. Shulchan Aruch says like this. It says Yesh Omrim shetzarich losif mechon lakodesh. Okay. וזמן תוספת זה הוא מתחילת השקיעה שאין השמש נראית על הארץ עד זמן בין השמשות. Says the Shulchan Aruch, we have to add on, right? Everybody agrees, we discussed this in previous Shiur. Everybody agrees that we need a time of Tosefet Shabbat. Tosefet Shabbat begins before Shkia, right? The time of Bein HaShmashot where we're not sure, that the fact that we treat that as Shabbat, that might be a Tosefet, but that's not enough. That might already be Shabbat. So we have to have, when it's certainly daytime, when it's only daytime before Shkia start, that's when you have to have Tosefet. So what does the Shulchan Aruch say? When is Zman Tosefet Shabbat? Right? You're not falling off your chair when you read this, so you haven't understood. He says, "Man tosefet zeh hu mitchilat hashkiya she'ein hashemesh nireit al haaretz ad zman bein hashmashot." From the time of sunset, when you can no longer see the sun, until bein hashmashot begins. I always thought that sunset is when bein hashmashot begins, but clearly not. But that's the Shulchan Aruch is saying, like Rabbeinu Tam, that bein hashmashot begins not with sunset. Bein hashmashot begins 3.25 mil after sunset. Okay, so it's still dark outside. We'll see what the Gra has to say about it. But it's still dark outside. Are you thinking? I know it's completely contradicts what I said earlier. When I said earlier that it goes by our senses. You think it's dark. You think it's night, but actually it's day. You're wrong. That's what I said. It's still daytime. And this is how Rabbeinu Tam would have pasken. By the way, lechumra lekula, meaning that according to his calculation, according to this, it's still day, so that means Shabbat hasn't begun or anything like that. And it seems to be that throughout the generations of Am Yisrael, I don't know, but in the times of nowadays, nobody holds like Rabbeinu Tam the Kula. There are many people who hold the Chumrah, but nobody holds like the Kula. It seems to be that
people start Shabbat later.
That once upon a time, it may have been the case. Again, how do they know that time? Because they didn't have watches or whatever. That's another question. But that's what it sounds like. That's the pshat. There he says that explicitly. This is a time of 3.25 mil. Okay, you want to do some of that time is Tosefet, or all of that time is Tosefet. But this time is Vaday Yom. So that is the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam. The Rama Aviyah writes as well. You want to do it earlier, you can do it earlier, and that's fine. But the Rama does not seem to disagree either. Now, as I said, the other opinion here is the opinion of the Geonim, and again, this is also made popular, I suppose, by the Gra, the Vilna Gaon. He says over here, source number 6, he says what Rabbeinu Tam is saying essentially is ridiculous. He says, how can you tell me? You look outside and it's dark and it's nightfall, and you're telling me it's still day and that's something. He says, that doesn't make any sense. So source number 6 says the Gra. This is wrong. Okay, this is related to Shalom's question before. He said, "Vemet eino kain," he says it can't be the same time period. And now he says like, so this part should have been involved. Right? He says you can see that this is just contradicted by what the reality is. Says the Gra. Okay, don't worry, we weren't going now. He says Bein HaShmashot begins from Shkia, from sunset that we can see. Just by the way, explains. We said right at the beginning, the time period of Bein HaShmashot, again, it's going to change. The fact is that you can see it based on altitude, based on latitude, based on all sorts of factors. based on the time of year, that the time from sunset until it gets dark, in Eretz Yisrael, for example, it's much shorter than it's going to be in Europe and other places. So this time period of 3/4, maybe that's an average. He says that's according to a certain horizon. That's in the time of Nisan and Tishrei, etc. That is the main point of contention between the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam and the opinion of the Gra and the Geonim, is when we say Shkiat HaChama in terms of beginning of Ben Mashot, do we mean Shkiat HaChama, which is sunset, which is that which we see, where the sun now goes below the horizon? That's what the Gra says. Whereas Rabbeinu Tam said, no, they're talking about Shkiat HaChama, talking about something else, something that happens later, something that we don't see. It may be it's a good limit spot. Yeah, I don't know if it's based on that, because again, as I say, we're going to see that there are many who are generally speaking, those who, if you say nowadays you hold Rabbeinu Tam means that Shabbat goes out later, right? You're going to be from like we said right at the beginning. We don't have the ability to hold it lakula. Although Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva, it's very interesting. Rav Moshe Feinstein asks, there are others who say that no, absolutely not, Rav Ovadia and others, if you even if you hold it's a good practice and it's a good chumrah to keep Shabbat for extra time at the end, because man Rabbeinu Tam, can you bring Shabbat in later? We say no. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says that we find there are certain kulot regarding Benesh Mashot when Shabbat comes in. Right? Anything which is a subit mishum shvut are not actually forbidden during Benesh Mashot if it's L'tzorech Mitzvah. You're saying L'tzorech Mitzvah, you need to do Benesh Mashot, you can. So Moshe Feinstein says from here, why? What's the logic? Why do we say that? Because Chazal went to say any time that may not be may not be Shabbat, therefore I don't have to be. So if there's an opinion that says it's not worse than Benesh Mashot, it's actually according to Rabbeinu Tam and all the other Rishonim hold back, it's better than Benesh Mashot, and therefore in that time period you could do this, have the same leniency that you would have with Benesh Mashot. He says, but there's a condition. He says that's only if you keep Rabbeinu Tam at the end of Shabbat. Right? You can't hold it. You can't hold it both ways. You can't be lakula here and lakula there as well. So that essentially is that essentially is a great machlok. I'll just show you again this diagram. So we saw from everyone's sefer. So we saw according to Rabbeinu Tam, this is the way it works. The entire period from essentially like this. The entire from the time of the only thing which is recognizable is the first shkia, meaning the shkia the sunset that we see. Right, because how do we define Seta Kochavim? The whole period from Shkia until Seta Kochavim, we said is meant to be 4 min. So according to Rabbeinu Tam, from the Shkia that you see, you count from there 3¼ mil, and that's what's called Shkia, and that's when Benesh Mashot starts, and then 3/4 mil later, that's Seta Kochavim, right? And now you can see on the diagram, the yellow is the part that's halachically day, and the black is what is halachically night. Okay. According to the Gra, the other opinion. Right, this is what we see. This is what we recognize. Right, so it begins Shkiat HaChama. That's sunset. 3/4 mil after that, so 13.5 minutes or 18 minutes, whatever it is. That is then Seta Kochavim. Outside it looks dark, right? And then until when the Gemara said until the 4 mil, that's talking about say Kol HaKochavim. That's talking about when it's complete darkness outside. Okay, whatever it means, but it's already nightfall. It's already nightfall for that period. That is how the Gra understands, and that is how we paskin nowadays. That is the minhag amongst everybody. I don't know that there's anybody who would say now. Again, very, very extenuating circumstances. You think of things like milchama, and that's or like refuah, like things of pikuach nefesh. The only thing I can think of is where there's a tzad anyway to say that you begin with right, and then and you can add that into it. I mean, there are tshuvot in other cases. For example, hefsek tara. The woman is nida and has to do a hefsek tara, which has to be done in day before night under very extenuating circumstances. She forgot and it was after Shkia and it was too late or whatever. Could you rely on the fact of non Rabbeinu Tam? So there, and again, and no quote me on this, but under very extenuating circumstances and on an individual basis, I know there are poskim who would maybe rely on it there. In terms of beginning Shabbat later, and the ordinary circumstances, it's hard to think of a case where somebody would, especially because we'll add something else into it that again, without getting into everything, but because of the astronomical situation, etc., there are those who say that this whole idea of Benesh Mashot and of Shkia Rishonah, of the first Shkia, and the second Shkia, and everything, and the time period that it took, that related to the reality in Europe, okay, and that related to, or maybe in Bava, but that's how Rabbeinu Tam understood it based on what he saw around him. When we look today in Eretz Yisrael, as we said, the period of twilight, or whatever, is much shorter to begin with, and therefore many poskim say this whole thing that it just does not apply in Eretz Yisrael. Have a look in source number 9. Okay, this is pre Yitzchak. So this is Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer tells. He says, "B'Yerushalayim Ner HaKodesh Shaminag Pashut Al Pi Agdolim Yeno K'Shita Zo Af La'akar Motzei Shabbat V'Lo Yimatzeh Gam HaMachmir Rak Echad Me'elef HaMachmir B'Motzei Shabbat Kedav Rabbeinu Tam." He says, we don't find in Eretz Yisrael you don't even find 1 in 1,000 who is stringent. You can always find more people to be stringent, but he says you don't. That's not. We don't follow the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam in Eretz Yisrael. If you look in footnote number 5. Right, the Tzitz Eliezer, of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, of Nevenzel, of Eliashiv, all concur the opinion of the ground may be followed l'katchila, relating to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, there are many sources here again which you can look up afterwards. We don't have time to go into all the technicalities now, but that is essentially the practice. Also, the Biur Halacha, notwithstanding that, the Biur Halacha in source number 8, he does say, he said that it was right to have this chumrah again at the end of Shabbat to have Rabbeinu Tam as well, and that's why some people still follow it. Rav Ovadia as well, source number 10, he says Maskana Dedina Shoel Kol Chalei B'Dvar Hashem Nachmir K'Shtat Rabbeinu Tam V'Rov Poskim Shlo La'asot Kol Melacha B'Motzei Shabbat Ad Shavo Shul Daled Milin Aynu Shabbat Chamesh. Right, so he says this is a good chumrah tab, and again notice he says Shitat Rabbeinu Tam V'Rov Poskim. Again, because it's not just when you look in the Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch, this is not just one, dat miut. Now we always think about, it's Rabbeinu Tam, right? Everybody holds like this, and Rabbeinu Tam holds something different. It's actually more closer to the opposite. But in any event, so therefore, those who have the minhag and many chassidiyot, etc., have the practice of bringing Shabbat out later, like Shtat Rabbeinu Tam. But as we've seen in Eretz Yisrael as well, there is a much more room to be maker, not to be concerned about it. And of course, this is only lechumra and not lekula. Okay, another siman which we have. So that on the one hand we're told that Benesh Mashot begins. That how do we measure the period? By the time period from Shkia, from sunset until Benesh Mashot until Tzeitat Kochavim. The Gemara also gives us another way of measuring it, which is even if we don't know what the time is, and again it may be that because that time changes throughout the year. But source number 2, sorry, we're jumping around a little bit today. Go back to page 156. Marav Yehuda Mashmuel, Kochav Echad Yom, Shnayim Benesh Mashot, Shlosha Laila. Right, depends how many stars you can see. If you can see 1 star, that's still day. See 2, that's Benesh Mashot, that's twilight. When you see 3, that is night. Tanya Namiyachi, Kochav Echad Yom, Shnayim Benesh Mashot, Shlosha Laila. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Lo Kochavim Gdolim Anirim B'Yom. What kind of stars are we talking about? Not very big stars, not small stars, just right? The medium-sized stars. Again, there's going to be a lot of discussion in the days of the Gemara. I imagine when things were much less built up and much less urban than they are today, and pollution, you could see the stars much more easily than you can now. The question is going to be when the Gemara tells us that the day ends, that nightfall begins, a bona fide night after Shkia, when you can see the stars. Does that mean that I have to go out and look out and be able to see the stars? Or does that mean that somebody who knows what they're doing and is looking in the right place could see the stars? But even though I can't see the stars, at least the stars can be seen. This is machlok in Achronim, this is machlok between Chaim Na'en and Tikochinsky as to how we pass relating to this particular question. But essentially, this is how if you go to source number 12. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch page 162. He says, "Tzarich lezayim menasot melacha ad sheira'u shlosha kochavim ktanim v'lo mfuzarim ela utzufim." There are 3 based on the Ran. There are 3 stars in one place that can be seen. It's a cloudy day, you should wait until you know that it's definitely nightfall. Again, all of these, we see this by Pesach as well, we see this by many different areas. This is the times of the Shulchan Aruch, you didn't have a watch, and you didn't have a luach, and you couldn't tell the times. Nowadays, so we don't have to go outside and look and see the stars, but just to understand what these times are based on and where it's calculated from. This time, well, it's important to know that this time when we can see these three stars and time it's printed on the luach is really a little bit after nightfall. So there is already a Tosefet Shabbat here, which is included at the end of Shabbat as well. So it says the Mishnah Berurah, Mishum Tosefet Shabbat. That's why you have to see three stars together. Okay, so this is not the first moment that actually Shabbat is out. That's why, for example, I've heard it said that there are some shuls where they daven married 11 minutes before the time that is printed on the right. How can you start davening earlier before? So it's already nightfall in the sense of Shema, etc. And we wait until then to make up the night because of Tosefet Shabbat. Then you can do melacha. Okay, and then you can see over here in source number 14, there's a bit of a summary of some of the different opinions in terms of how long we have to wait and when this time of Yom Kochavim Ketanim will be. So there are those who say with Tukachinsky, right, it will never be more than 43 minutes after Shkia. Some say 14 minutes, some say 15 minutes. So it could be at different places, etc. Okay, just to maybe lamchish. I think lamchish in English. To demonstrate right, what we were saying about the times and how the times change in different places in the world. So look on page 164. These are times taken from the Mais Manim website, which is a wonderful resource. They didn't pay me to say that. But in source number 15, for example, if you look in Tzvat, right, just a random Shabbat, January 6, 2024. Okay, they just picked a Shabbat in Tibet. So you see sunset, Shkia, that itself actually changes based on how we calculate it, based on where we are. But we're looking at, if you look in the left-hand column, so for example, they measure, right, sunset is being 4:45, and then nightfall is being 5:25. So you have essentially 40 minutes in between, which is the time of Ben Hashmashot. If you have a look in Trondheim, Norway, which I don't know why you want to go there for others, but assuming you were, so their sunset is at 2:54 in the afternoon. Right, and have a look at nightfall, only comes at 5:25, so it's almost 2 hours later, an hour and a half, no more, almost 3 hours later. So there, right, everything that we were talking about with Rabbeinu Tam, and it makes more, maybe makes more sense in terms of that reality, which 2.5 hours in between of Ben Hashmashot. Okay, so those are some of the considerations that go into it. Obviously, there's far more to talk about and a lot more complications, but let's just understand the basic framework. When we talk about Ben Hashmashot, so we have Shkia and we have Tzeit HaKochavim, and the amount of time in between 3/4 of a mil and to 4 mil. And as we've seen, according to Rabbeinu Tam, the reason why everything happens later is because Shkia is not actually Shkia that we see, but it's something that takes place later with the sun, whatever it is. But so paradoxically comes out to Rabbeinu Tam that it's already dark outside, but we would still count it as daytime. Again, based on what we've just seen, if this period of twilight is extending for much longer, right? So then it makes more sense. We can understand how it's not that Rabbeinu Tam is saying already it's dark for an hour outside and you're still holding it as day. Right, but that's the reality in Eretz Yisrael, and that's why it seems so strange, and that's maybe why the Poskim say that would not apply here. But based on the Shita of the Geonim and the Gra, again, Shkia is when we say that it's sunset, and then from then we have the period of 13.5 to 18 minutes, more or less, until we count it as night. Okay, so that is those are the parameters of Ben Hashmashot, and that is the difference in terms of when we bring out Shabbat based on Rabbeinu Tam or based on everybody else. Next week, B'ezrat Hashem will continue. Now that we know when it is, what do we have to do when we reach this time, whenever it is, in terms of Havdalah? Is Havdalah min Torah? Is it midrabanan? Can women make Havdalah? It's a big nafkamina as well in terms of who should make Havdalah in shul, in terms of whether you can go back home and make Havdalah for your wife again, or she has to say it herself. Eating before Havdalah, malacha before Havdalah, etc. All of that, B'ezrat Hashem next week. Okay, everyone for coming. Yeah.